The instant this story broke, it shifted the entire trajectory of the Iran nuclear file. And almost nobody is telling you why. Earlier today, reports verified that Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araqi touched down in St. Petersburg for a critical sit down with Vladimir Putin. Within hours, the Kremlin, through spokesman Dmitry Peskov, made one thing crystal clear. Russia's offer to assume custody of Iran's enriched uranium remains on the table. Not gossip, not conjecture, an active, standing proposal. And then came the sentence that should freeze you in place. It is not being acted upon. 4 ordinary words, but they expose an enormous geopolitical deadlock that most observers are entirely overlooking. Because here's what's actually unfolding under the surface. For months on end, the United States has hammered one central demand in every negotiation, every back-channel exchange, every diplomatic communication. Iran must surrender its enriched uranium, not scale it back, not freeze it, eliminate it. We're talking about approximately 450 kilograms enriched to 60%, material that could be advanced to weapons grade within weeks, sufficient quantity for several nuclear devices. This isn't merely one item on a lengthy checklist. This is the demand. Every ceasefire conversation, every round of indirect dialogue, every political message eventually comes back to this single non-negotiable benchmark. And now, almost from nowhere, Russia walks in with a fix that, at least on paper, resolves everything. Moscow is essentially saying, hand us the uranium, we'll relocate it from Iran. We'll house it on Russian territory. We'll reprocess it under international supervision. Iran retains its nuclear infrastructure. The hazardous material exits the country. The international community, including watchdogs like the International Atomic Energy Agency, can monitor every step. No war, no airstrikes, no escalation, a diplomatic exit ramp that sidesteps a worldwide crisis. But here's the catch. The piece nobody can ignore. This arrangement, the one that ticks every major box, was turned down. And that brings us to the genuine question driving this entire analysis. If a fix exists that prevents conflict, meets the central demand, and stabilizes the region, why was it dismissed? Let me put this as plainly as I can, because most of the press coverage is tiptoeing around it rather than saying it outright. Donald Trump rejected Vladimir Putin's offer to take possession of Iran's enriched uranium. This isn't guesswork. It was confirmed by Axios, where a U.S. official stated bluntly it hasn't been accepted. Now, on the surface, Washington's stance sounds defensible. They keep saying, we need the uranium secured, but that phrase conceals the genuine conflict. The United States agrees with the objective, but rejects the vehicle. They want the uranium out of Iran, just not under Russian control. And that distinction, minor on paper, enormous in practice, is the entire story playing out before us. Because look at what comes next. While Washington stalls Abbas Araqi, boards a plane and flies directly to St. Petersburg to sit down with Putin, that isn't a routine diplomatic stop. That's a signal. Iran is essentially answering, if America won't accept Russia as the solution, we'll deal with Russia directly anyway. And to truly grasp why this moment is significant, you have to look back not months, but years to the foundation of this whole problem. Under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the agreement Trump exited in 2018, Russia was already performing precisely this function. Iran shipped out roughly 97% of its enriched uranium stockpile. And where did it go? To Russia. It was managed by Rosatom, stored, processed, and supervised under international oversight. And here's the crucial point. This system functioned. There were no major breaches, no diversion of material, no collapse in monitoring. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed compliance for 3 consecutive years. The arrangement operated exactly as intended until the United States walked away and reinstated sanctions So when Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says today that Russia is the only nation with positive experience handling Iran's uranium, he isn't promoting Russia. He's stating a verifiable fact. This isn't a hypothetical proposal. It's a rerun of a system that already worked. Russia possesses the infrastructure, the legal framework, the storage capacity, and the working relationship with the IAEA to carry this out again almost instantly. Even officials tied to Rosatom have confirmed the transfer is technically achievable even under tough conditions. And experts note that coordination mechanisms to safely transport and monitor the material already exist. So technically, diplomatically, and historically, the answer is right there. Russia is prepared, Iran is engaging, the IAEA can oversee. Everything fits. Which leads us to the central question, the uncomfortable one that most Western reporting sidesteps. Why reject it? The answer has less to do with uranium and more to do with power. Washington's worry, based on reporting, is that letting Russia accept and process Iran's uranium would lift Moscow's standing in the global nuclear energy market. Russia, through Rosatom, already commands a substantial portion of worldwide uranium enrichment and nuclear fuel supply. If it absorbs Iran's stockpile, processes it, and possibly reintroduces it into the global fuel market, that boosts Russia's leverage across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. For the United States, which has invested years trying to cut dependence on Russian nuclear services, that's a strategic defeat. And to be honest, that worry isn't unreasonable. It's a coherent geopolitical calculation. But here's the price of that decision, and it's a heavy one. By rejecting Russia as custodian, the United States is essentially insisting that Iran surrender its uranium through a route that doesn't favor Russia. The trouble is, those alternative routes hardly exist. In reality, Iran is highly unlikely to deliver its uranium directly to the United States. It's equally improbable to trust U.S. allies like France or Japan with that material. And the notion of destroying the uranium inside Iran would demand a level of cooperation and trust that simply doesn't exist. So what you're left with is a contradiction. The United States wants the uranium gone. Russia presents a tested method to remove it. Iran is open to discussing it, but because of who controls the solution, not what the solution accomplishes, the deal is frozen. And that is precisely why today's meeting in St. Petersburg matters far more than it appears at first glance. So where does that leave the United States right now? In a position considerably more constrained than it appears on the surface. By rejecting Vladimir Putin's uranium offer, Washington has essentially trapped itself in a corner. The only mechanism on the table that is actually delivered before, the only one with a verified track record, has already been waved off. And while American officials hunt for an alternative that currently doesn't exist, one essential fact stays unchanged. Iran's enriched uranium remains inside Iran. That means the pressure campaign carries on. Volatility in global energy markets continues. Oil prices stay elevated and the broader conflict drags forward without a clear exit. Now, look at Abbas Araghchi's move today through that lens. His flight to St. Petersburg isn't merely diplomacy, it's strategy. Iran fully grasps the position the United States has placed itself in. Tehran knows Washington dismissed the Russian mechanism. It knows there's no ready replacement. And most critically, it knows that without settling the uranium question, the United States cannot conclude this crisis on its own terms. So instead of waiting passively, Iran is leaning into the one channel still available, Russia. And then Araghchi adds another dimension to this when he speaks to Iranian state media. He frames the visit as a valuable opportunity for consultations with Moscow and stresses that these discussions are particularly important at this stage. That phrase carries enormous weight. At this stage signals urgency, timing, and leverage. It tells you this isn't ordinary coordination. It's a moment where the balance of influence is shifting. Talks are stalled. Washington is wavering and the uranium question stays unresolved. In that vacuum, Russia's role doesn't diminish, it grows. Why? Because, as Dmitry Peskov verified, the offer is still standing. The mechanism exists. And by physically appearing in Russia, Iran is sending a message without saying it directly. The solution is available, it's functional, and it's waiting. But the United States chose not to use it. Simultaneously, Iran is ensuring that if Washington ultimately reverses its position, or if pressure builds from global markets and allies, depending on stability in choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the infrastructure for an agreement is already established and prepared to move. Now bring China into this calculation, because what Beijing isn't saying today is just as significant as what Moscow is saying. Before Araki even boarded his flight, he spoke with Wang Yi. That conversation happened before consultations with various regional players, which tells you something about priority and alignment. China had early visibility into Iran's thinking before others and possibly before key developments became public. And yet today, China has stayed completely silent. No comments about the visit, no reaction to the uranium proposal, no public posturing whatsoever. But that silence shouldn't be confused with absence. China's relationship with Iran's strategic programs runs deep. Multiple intelligence assessments point to Chinese components in Iran's missile systems, and Iran's military technology ecosystem has long depended on both Russian and Chinese contributions. Just days ago, China and Russia held discussions with the International Atomic Energy Agency, specifically regarding Iran's nuclear program. That gathering took place on April 24th, only 3 days before Arakchi arrives in St. Petersburg. That sequence isn't coincidental. It points to coordination, planning, alignment ahead of action. So what you're observing is a layered process. The IAEA meeting serves as a coordination phase. Today's meeting in Russia looks more like an execution phase. And China is watching from a position of quiet strength. The country that has already locked in long-term energy ties with Iran and possesses the economic leverage to influence outcomes without making any noise, which carries us back to the structural problem confronting the United States. It isn't simply a diplomatic disagreement, it's a strategic dilemma. Washington needs Iran's uranium removed. Russia has both the capability and the experience to remove it. The United States rejected that pathway. And right now, there's no viable alternative Iran would accept. That leaves only two genuine options. Eventually reconsider the Russian mechanism or pursue a far more dangerous route involving direct intervention. There have been discussions confirmed in reporting about the possibility of special operations forces seizing nuclear material inside Iran. But consider what that genuinely entails. That isn't a diplomatic remedy. That's military escalation. It would almost certainly violate any ceasefire framework, demand extremely intricate coordination, and almost certainly provoke a response from Tehran that could broaden the conflict in unpredictable ways. It's a scenario packed with variables nobody can fully manage. So this is the situation at this moment. As Araghchi sits across from Putin in St. Petersburg, the only peaceful path to remove Iran's uranium is the one offered by Russia and rejected by the United States. The only alternative involves force with all the risks that accompany it. And meanwhile, conditions on the ground keep deteriorating. Maritime tensions climb, economic pressure mounts, and the diplomatic window that was supposed to open during a ceasefire is gradually closing. Now, here's where the situation becomes nearly impossible to dismiss. Donald Trump himself stated that the uranium issue represents 99% of the deal. That's not interpretation. That's his framing. J.D. Vance reinforced the same point. So if the uranium question represents virtually the entire agreement and the only workable mechanism to settle it has already been rejected, then what you're really observing is this. The United States has effectively obstructed 99% of its own road to a deal. That isn't a minor diplomatic stumble. That's the heart of the entire process. And that is precisely why Abbas Araghchi is sitting in St. Petersburg with Vladimir Putin right now. This meeting isn't about determining whether Russia will accept the uranium. That part has already been signaled. It's about the details, the timeline, the verification structure with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the technical safeguards, and most importantly, the assurances that Russia can't simply turn around and use that material to expand its dominance in the global nuclear fuel market. And here's the essential observation. Those are solvable issues. These aren't existential geopolitical obstacles. They're engineering, legal, and regulatory matters. They can be negotiated, structured, and enforced. And Iran is in Russia right now precisely because the larger strategic question is already resolved. Russia's prepared. Iran is open to it. The IAEA can supervise it. The only remaining piece in this equation is a yes from Washington. Now, to be fair, there's a counterargument, and it deserves to be addressed head on. The concern is that Russia isn't acting from goodwill. Vladimir Putin isn't offering to take Iran's uranium as a courtesy to the international community. He's doing it because it grants Moscow leverage. It reinforces Russia's position in the global nuclear fuel supply chain. It places Russia as a central actor in any post-conflict Middle East arrangement. And from Washington's vantage point, handing that kind of strategic edge to Moscow is a legitimate worry. That skepticism isn't unreasonable. It's rooted in genuine geopolitical rivalry. But here's the decisive question. Not whether Russia gains, but whether the alternative is preferable. Because the alternative is what we're witnessing right now, a continuing blockade, a ceasefire that exists more on paper than in fact, climbing tensions in essential trade corridors like the Strait of Hormuz, elevated oil prices that ripple through global markets and strike consumers directly, and most critically, Iran's enriched uranium still sitting inside Iran untouched, unresolved, and increasingly central to the crisis. When you weigh those outcomes, the cost of dismissing the Russian mechanism begins to look heavier than the benefit of denying Moscow additional influence. That's the calculation that was made and rejected. And that rejection is exactly why Araghchi is in St. Petersburg today, while Washington is essentially waiting for a different solution to materialize. Now, looking ahead, the next stage of this story becomes even more critical. What's likely happening behind closed doors right now isn't abstract conversation, but refinement. Russia is anticipated to present a more thorough, updated version of its uranium custody offer, more specific than earlier drafts. This would probably include defined timelines for transfer, established storage conditions, structured IAEA oversight, and most crucially, explicit boundaries on what Russia can do with the material once it possesses it. That last component is the heart of the American objection, concerns about resale, reprocessing, and market leverage. If this updated proposal incorporates binding assurances, real constraints that prevent Russia from converting Iran's uranium into a geopolitical asset without wider consent, then the core U.S. concern is at least partly resolved. From there, the process becomes diplomatic transmission. Araghchi carries the framework back to Tehran. It moves through regional intermediaries. It eventually returns to Washington's desk. And at that point, the choice becomes unavoidable. Accept the mechanism or reject it again. If accepted, the consequences are immediate. The uranium question, the 99%, is settled. Pressure on global trade routes loosens. The path to ending the conflict opens. But if rejected once more, the consequences are equally evident. The conflict persists, and the diplomatic record begins to tell a very particular story. Iran indicated willingness. Russia supplied a mechanism, and the United States declined twice. That narrative carries weight. It shapes alliances, shapes global perception, and influences how future negotiations are framed. And then there's China, quiet but far from missing. Wang Yi and Beijing have adopted a posture of strategic silence. No public statements, no visible pressure, no open alignment in today's headlines. But behind that silence is influence. China continues purchasing Iranian oil, granting Tehran economic breathing space. It has already participated in discussions with Russia and the IAEA on Iran's nuclear file. It functions as a stabilizing force for Iran, not by speaking loudly, but by ensuring Iran has the capacity to wait it out. In many respects, China is shaping the environment without entering the spotlight. It's present without seeming present. And that quiet presence is what permits Iran to sit in St. Petersburg today, engaging with Russia rather than hurrying to respond to Washington, which carries us back to the simplest, most telling image of this whole situation. Donald Trump claimed there's a phone, a line of communication, a way forward, but that phone hasn't rung. Instead, Iraqi is sitting across from Putin discussing a mechanism that already exists, while the one country that needs that mechanism most has yet to embrace it. Now, let me add one more dimension, because this might be the most significant element of the entire puzzle, and it stretches well beyond uranium. In January 2025, just weeks before this conflict intensified, Iran and Russia signed a 20-year strategic partnership accord. This wasn't a ceremonial handshake. It was one of the most far-reaching bilateral frameworks either country has entered into in modern times. It encompasses economic cooperation, military coordination, and deep political alignment. It deliberately falls short of being a formal mutual defense treaty. But make no mistake, the level of integration it creates is substantial. So when Abbas Araghchi lands in St. Petersburg today to meet Vladimir Putin, he isn't entering a room as a negotiator seeking aid from an outsider. He's arriving as the representative of a treaty partner coordinating strategy with an aligned power. And that distinction completely transforms how you should read this meeting. This isn't Russia stepping into someone else's conflict as a neutral go-between. This is Russia being briefed, consulted, and possibly aligned by a country with which it holds long-term strategic commitments. It means the conversation taking place behind closed doors isn't just about, can Russia help resolve this? It's about, how do both sides position themselves within this conflict to optimize their results? Because Russia's interests here aren't theoretical. They're tangible, measurable, and in many respects profitable. During the height of recent tensions, when disturbances around the Strait of Hormuz drove global oil prices upward, Russia's energy revenues climbed. Reports indicate Moscow was bringing in hundreds of millions of euros per day during that stretch. That isn't incidental. That's a structural advantage. Every day, global supply remains constrained. Every day, prices stay elevated. Russia profits. So the longer the instability continues, the more financially beneficial the situation becomes for Moscow. Now consider that within the framework of what Dmitry Peskov said, that the uranium offer still stands. On the surface, it appears to be a constructive, solution-oriented proposal, and it may well be. But underneath, there's a deeper strategic question. What outcome does Russia genuinely prefer? A swift resolution that stabilizes markets and reduces its windfall, or a prolonged situation where it positions itself as the indispensable problem solver, offering solutions that may or may not be accepted while quietly profiting from the ongoing instability? This isn't about charging Russia with bad faith. It's about understanding incentives. Russia's position permits it to win across multiple scenarios. If the deal is accepted, Moscow becomes the central custodian of Iran's nuclear material, expands its influence in the global nuclear fuel market, and earns diplomatic credit as the country that helped solve a major international crisis. If the deal is rejected, Russia still gains financially from elevated energy prices and politically as it watches U.S. credibility face mounting pressure with every passing week of unresolved conflict. And when you pull back, you'll notice something even more striking. China's position mirrors this dynamic almost exactly. Beijing, represented by figures like Wang Yi, has stayed largely silent in public, but its strategic stance is plain. China benefits from continued access to Iranian energy resources, often on favorable terms. It benefits from disturbances that erode Western influence in global markets. And it benefits from a geopolitical climate where the United States seems incapable of enforcing or finalizing its own diplomatic objectives. China doesn't need to dominate the headlines to determine the outcome. Its role is quieter but equally consequential. By maintaining economic engagement with Iran and coordinating at key moments with Russia and international organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency, China establishes a foundation that allows Iran to remain patient, removing urgent